and local government to work together.
I call the honourable member Julianne Genta.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will also speak to the supplementary order paper 235 brought to the House by Ian Lees-Galloway. I have to commend Mr. Lees-Galloway for bringing this supplementary order paper to the House, and I do hope that the government will be listening with an open mind, because I know that the government says that it's a priority of theirs to get good value for money from taxpayer, the amount of money that taxpayers are putting into public transport, and also good value for money for those public transport passengers who are paying fares. And as Mr. Lees-Galloway quite rightly explained, the impact of the transitional measures in this bill at the moment will be that many regional councils will have to roll over existing contracts for a period of several years. Now, this could end up costing them millions of dollars. The only people who benefit from the transitional measures are the existing bus operators, who will essentially be in an extremely strong position where they will be able to negotiate what is good for them at the expense of ratepayers and at the expense of taxpayers. It's very perplexing to me that the New Zealand Transport Agency has not listened to the concerns raised by regional councils on this issue, as New Zealand Transport Agency is using some of its own money to pay for public transport services. And what we saw earlier this year was the Otago Regional Council went ahead and went to tender for the contracts for some of its bus services. It was able to negotiate a savings of in the order of millions of dollars. And then the New Zealand Transport Agency told the Otago Regional Council that they would not be providing them with the subsidy that normally they have as of right for their public transport services, because it didn't follow the model that NZTA has decided to go with. Now, that would have meant rolling over contracts for Otago Regional Council until 2016, rather than going to competitive tender. Now, if this government actually believes in competition and in getting good value for money, then I think they must support these absolutely reasonable changes put forward in Supplementary Order Paper 235, because they will enable regional councils to tender for contracts in the interim period until they have gone ahead and established their new public transport plan and are able to go ahead and contract under that in several years' time. So at stake is millions of dollars, millions of ratepayers and taxpayers' dollars, and it's really an opportunity, I think, for the government to show their commitment to value for money and demonstrate that they aren't actually going to simply listen to the demands of profitable bus operators who don't want to have to compete. Speaking to other parts of Part 1, I would like to raise the issue of the purpose of the Act, which a number of submitters understood the government's interest in simplifying the existing purpose. But it is important to realize that actually the land transport system has a wide variety of effects on New Zealand's well-being. So the land transport system cannot be considered alone when, in fact, the land transport system, the roads that we put in place, the public transport that we have in place, the rail network, all of that contributes to a number of other areas that the government is directly responsible for. So, for example, in the area of public health, there's been an enormous amount of research demonstrating that the transport choices that people have available to them directly impact on their health. And this is a ticking time bomb for the New Zealand public health system, because in neighbourhoods where children are unable to walk and cycle safely to school and they have to be driven, they are much more likely to be overweight, to not get enough activity, and therefore in the future they're much more likely to suffer from chronic diseases. And we all know that chronic diseases like diabetes and heart disease are on the increase in New Zealand. They're on the increase in most rich countries, and a certain portion of that increase is directly due to the lack of activity that happens when you have a transport system that is entirely reliant on... Mr. Chair?
Julianne Genter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When you have a transport system that is entirely or overwhelmingly reliant on private vehicles, there are decreasing levels of physical activity, and I encourage the government to listen carefully to the recommendations of doctors and nurses and other public health professionals associations which have been speaking out on this issue and saying, actually, we do need to take into account the health impacts of our transport system. There are a number of other co-benefits that need to be taken into account when we're deciding what transport projects we invest in priority. And one of these is carbon emissions. So our transport sector is the single biggest contributor to our carbon emissions. It's been the fastest growing area of carbon emissions, and it is like the overwhelming majority of our imports of oil go on transport. So this has a wide variety of impacts, both from the need that we have to reduce our carbon emissions in the future, like that is undeniable. We will have to do that. So we need to take that into account when we're planning transport projects that are going to last 30 or 40 or 50 or 100 years in the future. How are they going to enable New Zealand to reduce its carbon emissions? But there's an added economic benefit to reducing carbon emissions, and that is we reduce our oil imports. Now, our oil bill, New Zealand's oil bill, last year was $8 billion. For the past decade, we have not increased much, or if at all, the amount of oil that we're importing. We're using the same amount of oil that we did in the early part of the last decade. But we're spending more than twice as much. So our oil imports have gone from under $4 billion to $8 billion last year. Now, all of that contributes to our current account deficit. And it's not good for the New Zealand economy to be so reliant on imported oil. If the value of the New Zealand dollar was more realistic than it is at the moment it's hovering towards 0.9 on the US dollar, petrol prices would be through the roof, and we would have significant harm to our economy because households and business simply wouldn't be able to get where they need to go without spending a ton of money on petrol. We're already spending a lot of money on petrol, $8 billion. We would be spending even more if the New Zealand dollar was at a more realistic exchange rate. So changing the purpose of the Act to only consider a few narrow transport criteria rather than the broader impacts that transport has on our public health system, on New Zealanders' well-being, and on our economy is very short-sighted. And unfortunately, it is quite a typical characteristic of this government to not understand the interrelationship between different things that we're doing. And so they may make decisions now that seem to make sense from a transport point of view, although actually they don't, because the vast majority of the transport budget is being spent on a few big motorway projects that don't even come out good on their own narrow assessment of transport benefits. They have very low benefit to cost ratios, even when you don't consider the wider impacts. So maybe it's not a problem of not understanding the interrelationships, but simply not caring about what the economic impacts of our transport spend are going to be and wanting to build a few big, shiny new projects because they think it'll make them look good. So I was really struck by the submitters that came and all seemed to sing from the same song sheet. Submission after submission after submission said that it's really important to consider the wider impacts of transport in the purpose of the Land Transport Management Act. And so amending the purpose of the Land Transport Management Act to reduce it, to get rid of words that are really important, like affordability, like the impact on public health, like environmental sustainability and safety, is going to very much narrow the considerations that should be and can be taken into consideration when we're prioritizing our transport budget on different projects. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the honourable member